History holds many secrets, but few are as tragic or as haunting as this one. A queen at the height of her power, faced with an impossible choice. Her sacrifice would shape a dynasty, but cost her everything. Was it duty, fate, or something darker that sealed her end? Today, we uncover the chilling story of a royal mother who gave her life so her son could inherit the crown. But before we lift the veil on this forgotten tale, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. A woman's body can make two kinds of blood. One ends a life, the other begins it. That October night, the chamber reeked of both. Sweet iron-hot milk and the faint perfume of dried roses mixed now with sweat bile, and something older, something final. The Queen of England was curled among damp sheets in a room of whispered prayers and hissing fire. Jane Seymour, third wife to Henry VIII, lay barely conscious, her hair matted to her face, skin as white as the pillows pressed beneath her hips. Her breaths came shallow, a sound like water leaking through rotting wood. Somewhere nearby, an infant cried, small and relentless. But it was not for her. The boy Edward, the longed-for son, was born healthy. The court rejoiced. The kingdom celebrated. The king wept with pride. But Jane was still bleeding, and bleeding, and bleeding. The blood did not gush. It wept, a slow, relentless undoing of the queen from the inside. Every time her heart pulsed, a part of her left her body. A crimson memory in the linen. Her hands trembled when she tried to touch her abdomen, but the strength was gone. "Is he alive?" she asked, lips barely parting. One of the midwives nodded. Jane smiled, then turned her face to the wall. The child had been taken first to the king, then to the chapel where choirs sang for his soul and banners were raised. Henry's legacy had finally arrived, pink and perfect. But here in the stale candlelight, Jane's body was unraveling. 3 days passed. Her fever began the first night, subtle, almost elegant in its cruelty. Then came the rigors. She shivered beneath woolen layers even as her body boiled from within. Her milk turned sour. Her lips split open as she whispered old prayers learned in girlhood. She asked for her mother. She asked for God. She did not ask for Henry. He did not come. Some said he was busy in council. Others whispered that he simply could not stomach the sight of her now bloated, torn, filthy, with the scent of death. Jane had been loved for her gentleness, her chastity, her pale perfection. But love is a fragile thing in the presence of rot. Servants moved silently around her, lighting more candles. Always more candles. Light to drive back the shadow creeping along the walls. They burned herbs in the corners, lavender thyme, bitter orange. But the chamber still smelled of blood and milk, and beneath it all decay. One maid, no older than 15, claimed she saw a shadow rise from Jane's chest during the second night drift toward the cradle and vanish into the tapestries. She said nothing, only crossed herself, and began to hum a hymn her grandmother had taught her, one meant to comfort the dying. Jane's body no longer responded to poultices or prayer. Her belly, which had carried a king's heir, was now swollen and hard. Her legs were numb. The physicians whispered the word, childbed fever, but no one dared speak it to the king. She slipped in and out of wakefulness. Once she seemed to see the infant again, but not wrapped in cloth of gold. He lay still in a small wooden box, lips, blue eyes open. She screamed, then passed out. It was a dream, they told her, a fever dream. But Jane did not answer. She was seeing something none of them could. By the 6th day, her voice had gone. She mouthed words to no one. When the priest came, she clutched his sleeve. Her fingers left blood behind. He gave her the final rites. The last oil was dabbed upon her brow, her lips, her hands. She did not blink. On the 9th day, the king sent her a letter. "You have given me the greatest joy," it read. God keep you." Jane was too weak to hold the parchment. A lady-in-waiting read it aloud, voice faltering. Jane turned her head and closed her eyes. The physicians would later describe her death as peaceful. They used words like sleep and release, but the truth was slower, uglier. Her breathing grew wet. Her mouth hung open. Her skin, already pale, took on a faint greenish hue around the jaw and hairline. Her pulse thinned like thread. The bleeding never really stopped. They changed the sheets 6 times. At dawn on the 13th day, she moaned once, then nothing. She was 30 years old. They bathed her body in rosewater. They combed her hair. They dressed her in white. The women wept, but quietly. No spectacle, no scandal. Jane Seymour had died not as a fallen queen, but as a sanctified one. The one who gave England its prince. The one who did not disappoint. In death, she was perfect, and that's how they would remember her. But the room still stank of blood and milk. Jane was never meant to be remembered. Not like Anne with her sharp tongue and sharper eyes. Not like Catherine cloaked in Spanish dignity and granite faith. Jane was pale. That was the first thing they noticed. Pale like frost. Pale like pressed linen. Her voice was low, often unheard unless addressed. She did not interrupt. She did not laugh at court. Her presence was less performance, more suggestion, an echo in a corridor, the smell of lavender left behind on a prayer book. And that is why they chose her. From girlhood, Jane Seymour was taught to fold herself inward. She learned obedience before she learned language. At Wolf Hall, her family estate, she was raised not to speak, but to listen. Her mother told her once, "A quiet woman commands more than a clever one." Jane believed her. She practiced silence the way others practiced song or swordplay. Her handwriting was modest, her stitches flawless, her steps always measured. She was not born to dazzle. She was born to endure. The court saw it. The king saw it. Eventually, so did Anne. In the final months of Anne Boleyn's reign, Jane drifted into Henry's gaze like a ghost, white sleeves, downcast eyes, nothing but stillness. She curtsied deeper than required. She waited longer to speak, and she never not once gave him the chase he expected. Where Anne had danced, Jane stood still. Where Anne had defied, Jane deferred. It was not seduction, it was absence. And in that absence, Henry saw a purity he thought he could control. Her body became prophecy. "She is fertile," one of the Queen's enemies whispered. Look at her hips. The rumors fed on themselves, not because Jane flaunted them, no, because she never denied them. She let others see what they wanted. The empty space behind her eyes became a canvas for power-hungry men and anxious courtiers. Into Jane, they poured every hope of a quiet, compliant womb. She did not need to be brilliant. She needed to be receptive. Her brothers helped, Edward Seymour especially, a cold man with warm ambitions. He coached her in caution and positioning, in the careful art of appearing passive while advancing. "Don't smile too much," he told her. "Don't speak unless spoken to. Never speak first." And so Jane became an ornament, a prayer in the flesh, a woman with no past, no scandal, no threat. Even the king's counselors began to whisper that Anne's fire had grown too dangerous. They wanted water now, cold, clear, quiet water. Jane wore pale blue when she was summoned to court. She bowed her head as Henry kissed her hand. She did not flinch. She did not smile. But her fingers curled the moment he turned away. Anne watched it all unfold. The glances, the silence, the way Jane never once looked her in the eye. Anne had fought for everything. Jane absorbed it. Anne bled her soul to be queen. Jane was simply offered it and took it. Some said she was a pawn, others a puppet. But pawns do not close their eyes when kings touch them. Puppets do not blush at the mention of sons. Deep beneath Jane's composure was a seed of ambition, small, hungry, and cloaked in prayer. She wanted not glory, but certainty. A crown not of gold, but of purpose. To give the king what no other could. To be necessary. When Anne was arrested, Jane stayed behind her chamber doors. She did not cheer. She did not mourn. She sat by the window and stitched a small cushion with the royal crest. When Anne was executed, Jane did not attend, but she watched the ravens circle the tower. The morning after the scaffold, Jane was moved to the palace, not with fanfare, with calculation. Her wedding was quiet, her coronation delayed, but her presence was already in every room. Her scent, her stillness. She became the atmosphere itself. Henry called her his true wife. He called the others mistakes. He kissed her gently in public, stroked her hair, whispered of sons. She blushed and nodded. She let him fill her silence with his fantasies. Every time he said heir, she closed her eyes and imagined herself rooted to the throne, not as queen, but as soil, as womb, as conduit. And then she bled. Not her usual courses, a different kind, a darker red. Not loss, but promise. She told her ladies in secret. They wept with joy. The king was informed. He broke into tears, and Jane felt fear for the first time, not because of motherhood, but because she understood what would now be expected of her body: to grow, to stretch, to ache, to break. Her hips would become scaffolds, her spine a rod for royal weight. Every movement she made now echoed with political meaning. Rest, they told her. Eat, pray. Do not walk in cold rooms. Do not read disturbing scripture. Avoid black cats. Think only of sons. She nodded. But in the silence of her chamber, she began to see things. Her reflection did not blink when she turned away. The cradle, still empty, rocked slightly when no one touched it. The fire crackled in rhythms she didn't recognize. Her ladies spoke in whispers, but sometimes their mouths didn't move. Jane said nothing. She folded the fear inward, just as she had all her life. Her body had become royal property, and she would give it willingly, even if it cost her breath, even if it cost her name. The walls of Whitehall were still damp with prayers for Anne's soul when Jane crossed the threshold. She moved like candle smoke, soft, lingering, nearly invisible. A ghost of silk and ivory in a palace still echoing with screams. They had scrubbed the floor where Anne had walked. They had taken down her tapestries, rolled them in silence, and locked them in cellars. Every piece of her had to vanish. Only the bloodstains resisted. Jane saw them as she passed. Small brown-black constellations embedded in the rushes. They had tried to cover them with new rugs, velvet, foreign. But blood is a tenacious thing, like memory, like guilt. She did not look away. Anne's final breath had barely cooled on the scaffold when Henry summoned Jane. There was no mourning, only a ring hastily fitted to Jane's finger. Her hands trembled when he slid it on, not from passion, but from chill. The room was warm, but Jane had begun to feel cold in her bones. In the weeks that followed, she became the royal shadow. She did not rule. She absorbed. Her gowns bore no jewels. Her hair was bound modestly. When the court laughed, she smiled softly, but never joined in. When Henry spoke, she nodded, never interrupting, never contradicting. Her power was the space she did not take up. The silence she wore like a veil. Yet the palace changed for her. Anne's emblem, the falcon, was stripped from every carving, each banner, every goblet. Jane's badge, a phoenix rising from a castle tower, replaced it. It was an odd choice. A phoenix signifies resurrection, but Jane had not burned. She had simply waited. The irony did not escape the servants. "She's no phoenix," they whispered. "She's a shroud." At night, Jane wandered the corridors with her ladies trailing a scent of violet water and iron. Rooms were being refitted, pillows embroidered with Jane's initials. portraits of Anne removed and replaced with blank panels for now. Her likeness would come later when her womb had proven her worth. She noticed one of the old tapestries still hanging in a back corridor, hastily left perhaps too heavy to remove. It depicted a garden of virtue. In its corner, a woman knelt by a fountain, her face turned upward in devotion. But the threads had darkened. The woman's hands were stained red. Jane stood there for nearly an hour, watching. One lady asked if she was praying. Jane only said, "No, I am remembering." But remembering what? She had never spoken to Anne at length, only bowed, curtsied, avoided her gaze. And yet Anne had haunted the palace with such force that Jane often felt she knew her. Now she felt something colder possession. Jane wore the crown that still smelled of another's skin. She slept in sheets where love had once turned to rage. And worse, she knew that she too could vanish. There was no guarantee of permanence, only the king's satisfaction. And satisfaction was a delicate, shifting thing. One misstep, and she would become another portrait, painted over another name, erased from the royal book of hours. The knowledge made her careful, every gesture rehearsed, every sigh measured. Her voice became softer still, but her belly began to swell, and with it, the court began to breathe again. The corridors that had been thick with unease began to hum. Men smiled when they passed her. Nobles bowed more deeply. Gifts arrived in her antechamber without signatures. Tiny silver rattles, bolts of soft wool, a carved wooden cradle with golden hinges. Even the king's mood improved. He walked straighter, laughed louder. He touched her often on the hand, the back once even kissed her in front of a German envoy. The gesture was political, always political. Jane accepted it all without question, but alone at night she could not sleep. The fire in her chamber flared and dimmed without warning. The mirror by her bed warped her reflection when the candlelight flickered. And once, just once, she awoke to the sound of footsteps on stone. Not the heavy tread of guards, nor the soft steps of her ladies. Bare feet, running. She rose from her bed, trembling, and stepped into the corridor. Nothing, only the tapestry. The one with the garden and the woman with blood on her hands. But the woman's head had turned. Jane did not scream. She returned to bed and whispered a name she was never heard to speak again, Anne. She never told anyone. But from that night on, she insisted the tapestry be removed. The servants complied, but one of them claimed, while lifting the panel from its iron hooks, to have heard the sound of weeping. The king never asked about the tapestry. He had no need. Jane was his queen now, and she had one purpose: to give him a son. Everything else, visions, footsteps, dreams, could be dismissed as female frailty. Even Jane began to doubt herself. But the palace did not forget. The walls had absorbed too many secrets. The stones still remembered the cries. And as Jane drifted through gilded halls and embroidered chambers, she felt the pressure of every queen before her, each one a layer beneath her skin. She did not speak of it. She only smiled, bowed, and placed her hand protectively over her growing womb. The throne was no longer carved from oak and crowned with gold. It lived now within her. In her womb, in her bones, in the aching stretch of her belly. Jane Seymour was no longer simply queen. She was sacred vessel, and sacred vessels were not allowed to break. Yet every part of her felt as though it might. The pregnancy was declared divine. Bishops gave thanks from pulpits. Court poets wrote verses about God's favor and English soil reborn. Women came forward with omened stars that burned brighter doves that nested out of season a midwife who had dreamt of a pale queen with fire in her veins. But behind the sanctified language and embroidered gowns, Jane's body was under siege. She woke each morning, soaked in sweat, her breath sharp ribs stabbing outward like branches in a storm. Her appetite vanished, her ankles swelled. The baby kicked with unnatural rhythm, sometimes violently, as if clawing at her from within. The midwives said this meant strength, but Jane, lying awake in the candlelit silence, was not so sure. She began to dread the cradle. It stood in the corner of her chamber, draped in crimson silk, its wood carved with lions and lilies. No child had ever lain in it. Sometimes when the firelight shifted, she thought it rocked slightly. Once she ordered it covered, but it did no good. She could feel it there in the dark, waiting. The court tiptoed around her body, now measured her steps, her meals, her breath. "Do not bend too far," they whispered. "Rest often. Pray more. Speak less." Henry sent her prayers written in his own hand, clumsy Latin verses copied from a priest's tongue. He kissed her forehead before retiring, but never lingered. It was not love he offered, but investment. Jane understood. Her flesh was now the kingdom's gamble. Her smile was fragile, her laughter almost absent, and when she looked in the mirror, she did not see herself. Her features had changed, hollowed, her skin waxen stretched, her eyes ringed in shadow. "You are radiant," her ladies said, and she nodded but thought of wax figures, of death masks. She began to hear voices in the walls, not word scraps, breaths, whispers that stopped the moment she turned. Once she caught the scent of Anne's perfume orange blossom and cloves and vomited. No one believed her. They told her the mind plays tricks. But Jane had never been one for imagination. Her reality was the tighter prison. By midsummer, her belly had grown so large that she could no longer kneel for prayer. So a cushion was brought and a servant supported her shoulders as she bowed. The child kicked as if in protest. During Mass, she grew faint. The priest's voice became hollow. The candles flickered. She reached for the altar and whispered, "Is this what it takes?" No one answered. Later she asked her confessor if death in childbirth counted as martyrdom. The man paled. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "you will live. You must." But Jane had not asked if she would live, only what it meant if she didn't. In dreams, she saw herself split open, not in violence, but in ritual. Draped in cloth of gold, surrounded by veiled figures, her stomach opened like a reliquary. Inside, not a child, but a throne. The child, nowhere. Just the empty crown, the sound of 1,000 people cheering. She awoke, screaming. The cradle rocked. Servants whispered of curses, of Anne's vengeance, of a cycle repeating. Jane was too tired to protest. Even her bones ached differently now, as if being reconfigured. Her hips no longer felt like hers. Her ribs flared outward like doors forced open. Sometimes when she coughed, she tasted copper. Once while bathing, a maid gasped there were bruises along her thighs, blue and circular, as if gripped by something invisible. She said it must have been the bed frame, but she had not moved all night. The midwives became grim in their rituals. They placed charms at the door, a sprig of rosemary under the mattress, salt at the windowsill. One anointed her wrists with holy oil and murmured in Latin until Jane wept. "I'm not afraid to die," Jane whispered. "No," the woman answered, "but you should be." Word spread. The queen was not well. The king was told she was simply tired. He accepted it. He had waited so long for a son. He would not tolerate omens. Still, he ordered more guards at her chamber doors, not for protection, but containment. By September, Jane could barely walk. She took to her chair wheeled by servants swaddled in furs, even on warm days. She said little, but her eyes followed the cradle wherever it stood as if tethered to it. Her ladies told stories to keep her calm, legends of queens who labored in joy of miracle births. Jane listened, hands resting on her belly as if restraining it. She bled once, just a smear. The midwives paled. Jane only smiled. "He's trying to come early," she whispered. But the child did not come early. He waited, and so did the court. The rooms around her grew quieter. The doors stayed closed longer. The tapestry that had replaced the garden now showed a lion and a swan. The lion, they said, was the king, the swan the queen. But Jane knew swans were not gentle. Swans drowned their rivals. She dreamed again of the cradle. This time it was full, but not with a child. A crown, its edges bloodied. The child was gone. She could still hear it crying. When she woke, there was silence and blood in the sheets. The first cry came at 2 hours past midnight. Sharp, piercing, male. The boy was born alive, and the Queen was dying. Jane lay motionless, the sound of the infant's voice cutting through the chamber like a blade through silk. The women around her exhaled relief. Some dropped to their knees. Others whispered, "A son, a son." One wept openly. It had been over 20 years since England had heard that sound in a royal birth, the scream of a living male heir. But beneath the jubilation, the Queen's eyes fluttered. She was conscious, barely. Her lips moved, though no sound emerged. Her throat was dry, crusted with the breath of pain. Her hands twitched on the sheets, reaching not toward the child, not toward the priest, but to the hollow space beside her, as though grasping for something lost. The midwives were too busy to notice. They did not see the stain spreading beneath her hips. They did not see how it bloomed slowly, like a dark rose from her flesh. Edward was whisked away, wrapped in silks of scarlet and gold, borne high through the halls by servants who wept as they ran. He would be shown to the king, presented at once. No delay, no hesitation. The people were to be told. A procession was already being planned. Jane's body, meanwhile, remained behind, still unwept for, bleeding. The crown laid beside her on a crimson cushion had slipped during the labor. One corner of it touched the floor. A lady-in-waiting lifted it quickly, whispered an apology as if to the crown itself, and replaced it. The movement stirred no reaction in Jane. She stared at the ceiling. Her lips curved into something that could not decide between a smile and a grimace. She had done what no other queen had, and now, like all the others, she would disappear. The news reached Henry as the sun rose. He kissed the infant's forehead, wept, and declared a holiday. "God has smiled on England," he announced, voice cracking with emotion. "My line is secure. The future is born." He did not ask about Jane until later that evening. When he did, he was told she was resting. They did not mention the blood-soaked linens, or the fever that had already begun. By the time the bells of St. Paul's rang to celebrate the heir, Jane had been moved to a chamber lit with 30 candles. Her skin had taken on a strange sheen, pale but glistening, as if already halfway into wax. She murmured constantly fragments of the paternoster names of saints' words from dreams. Her womb emptied, but not closed, contracted still, as if echoing the final convulsions of creation. No one could stop the bleeding. It came in waves, unseen at first, pooling silently between shifts of bed linen. Her inner tissues, torn and unrepaired, refused to clot. No herb or balm soothed it. No prayer slowed it. When she was lifted to change the sheets, a trail of red led from the mattress to the basin where her nightclothes were wrung out with shaking hands. The priest was summoned again. This time, not in ritual, but in dread. He saw the Queen and flinched. Her lips were dark. Her breathing rattled. Her fingers blew at the tips. She did not recognize him, or perhaps she did, and simply chose not to speak. That afternoon, the cradle was brought into her chamber. Empty, adorned with fresh silks, gold embroidery, scented with crushed roses. They told her it was a symbol, that the boy slept elsewhere safer, that he was strong-fed, warm. Jane looked at the cradle, not with longing, with terror. She turned her face away and whispered, "Don't let it touch me." The women hushed her, told her to rest. That night, Henry visited. He stood in the doorway, did not enter. The candlelight flickered against his doublet. His face was unreadable. Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he had already begun to grieve. Jane looked at him or past him and said softly, "I hope he will have your hands." Henry did not respond. He turned and left. Behind him, Jane whispered to no one. "Then God help him." The cradle rocked once. No one touched it. The blood had slowed. But that was worse. A trick. The physicians whispered the term delirium of the final ebb. The body sometimes calmed before it stopped. They had seen it before. Her skin had cooled, but she sweated. Her eyes were glassy, flickering, and still she tried to smile when spoken to. She asked for Edward again. They told her tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. The next morning, she did not speak. She drifted, a breath every few minutes. The scent in the room had changed, less like flowers, more like iron. Her death came not as a cry, but a sigh, the kind one gives when surrendering not to pain, but to inevitability. The crown remained beside her. The cradle stood at the foot of the bed. The child Edward would reign briefly, sickly and doomed. But that was years away. For now only the silence remained, and the slow, steady dripping of blood that no one could stop. Jane Seymour had given England its prince, and England had taken her in return. The candles never went out. 13 days they burned long tapers in heavy brass holders, wax curling into pools, smoke threading upward in slow spirals. When one collapsed into itself with a faint hiss, another was lit. There was always a flame, always light to keep the dark from creeping fully in. And in that light, Jane Seymour withered. Her chamber became a sanctuary of watching, of waiting. Servants came and went in silence. Physicians hovered offering the same words each day, improving stable still with us, but their faces said otherwise. They didn't look at her when they spoke. They looked at the king, at the walls, at the floor, anywhere but the Queen's face. Because Jane was not truly here. Not anymore. Her breaths came thin and rattling, stretched far apart, like forgotten notes in a dying song. Her eyes, when open, fixed on something not present. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was in fragments. Prayers, half-remembered memories, whispered to no one names that made the women beside her flinch. "Thomas," she said once. No one knew which one. Another time, "Forgive the cradle." It made one of the maids drop her bowl. Each hour passed like a vigil. The air in the room grew thick, not hot, but wet, like a greenhouse choked with stagnant breath. Flowers filled every surface. Lilies, white roses, hyssop for purity, marigolds for mourning. But within days, the petals turned brown. Their scent shifted, sweetness spoiled. The flowers began to rot faster than they could be replaced. Jane's body followed. The fever never left. Her skin grew flushed, then pallid, then tinged with green. Her tongue swelled. Her fingertips darkened. Once her legs were uncovered to change the linens. The flesh beneath was bruised in strange, unnatural patterns, as if something had gripped her from inside and refused to let go. The midwives said nothing. They just crossed themselves. The cradle still stood at the foot of the bed. It had not been removed. Some said the king ordered it kept there. Others claimed Jane herself had whispered, "Let it watch." No one knew what that meant. No one dared ask. Henry did not return to the room. He sent inquiries through courtiers' notes via chaplains' occasional trays of sweetmeats she never touched. But he would not see her not like this. Not when she no longer resembled the perfect image he had constructed. Jane had become too real. And reality to kings is dangerous. In those 13 days, she was anointed 3 times. Not because the first failed, but because they were never sure she'd survive the night. Each time the oils were applied with care. Her forehead, her lips, her hands. Her skin did not absorb them. By the 9th day, her teeth began to loosen. Her mouth bled when she tried to speak. She no longer asked for Edward. She no longer asked for God. Only once did she break her silence. The nurse came to change her shift, and Jane, eyes open, turned her head and whispered, Am I the first? The woman froze. She didn't understand. Am I the first they've buried alive? Her lips cracked as she smiled. The nurse ran. The next day, the room was filled with incense, heavy, suffocating. The scent of frankincense, myrrh, something bitter beneath. They said it was to purify, but it was also to mask, because now the queen smelled of death. Even as she breathed, her body swelled, her skin began to blister. One of her ladies wept and said, "It is not her anymore." But it was. It was Jane stretched thin across the edge of life, flickering like the candles that burned beside her. She had given everything, and the world was taking its time in letting her go. On the 12th night, the cradle creaked. Everyone heard it. There was no wind, no servant nearby, and yet the carved wood groaned slowly, rocking, as if something unseen had shifted its weight inside. The priest turned pale. He muttered a blessing, then left the room, and didn't return. Jane's fingers twitched. Her breath caught. And then stillness, only for a moment. Then another breath, but slower. The midwife watching over her crossed herself and whispered, "Not yet. Not yet." They watched her all through the night. No one spoke. No one slept. By dawn, she had not moved. Her chest no longer rose. The room which had held its breath with her seemed to sag walls, bowed tapestries, drooped the very stones, exhaling as though exhausted by her endurance. But before they could announce her death, she gasped, a final desperate rattling intake of air. And then, nothing. Not quiet. Absence. The kind that hollows the space around it. They waited a full hour before touching her. When they finally did, her skin was ice, her eyes open, her mouth slightly parted as if still mid-prayer. A single tear had dried on her cheek, or perhaps it was only a shimmer of light from the candle beside her. No one touched it to check. They washed her gently. Her body no longer bled. There was no need. The flowers were replaced one last time. The crown was lifted and cleaned. The cradle was removed, covered in a black cloth. As they carried her out, her limbs wrapped in linen and lavender, someone whispered, "She was the lucky one." Because she had died a queen. Because she had not lived long enough to be forgotten in disgrace. Because she gave England its heir. Because she did not live long enough to see what became of him. The candles were finally extinguished. 13 days of light. And then darkness. There was no scream, no blade, no crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, hushed beneath the shadow of the scaffold. No soaked straw, no crimson splash on stone. Jane Seymour died quietly, and that is what made her perfect. The queen who birthed the future needed no spectacle, only silk shadow and silence. Her funeral was not a punishment, but a performance. A script without drama, carefully choreographed by the same court that had once choreographed Anne Boleyn's downfall. But where Anne had danced to her death to the sound of drums, Jane drifted into hers, with the scent of lilies. They called it honor, but it was a containment. From the moment her breath ceased, Jane's body was claimed not by God, but by legacy. Her corpse was not hers. It belonged to the state, to the crown, to the narrative. She had died the way the king needed her to, beautiful, sacrificial, complete, and thus her death was treated like a holy relic. Her ladies were instructed not to speak of her final days, not of the stench, not of the rot that set into her fingertips before the priest had even finished the last prayer, not of the moaning on the 7th night, or the cradle, especially not the cradle. Instead, her face was cast in wax, not as it was in the end, but as it had been, once cool, serene lips faintly curled, as if still proud to be the mother of a king. The wax mask was placed above her coffin for the procession, lit from below by torches. In the flickering light, it appeared to breathe. Some swore they saw the lips move. The court ignored them. Instead, the body was wrapped in velvet, sealed in a lead-lined casket, the lid screwed down with iron nails. No one, not even her closest lady, was allowed to look upon her again. They said it was out of respect, but respect can be another word for erasure. The procession moved slowly through the autumn morning mist. The people gathered, heads bowed, some weeping, others quiet with confusion. For years they had been told to hate Anne, to revere Catherine, to pray for sons. Now the woman who had given them the son was being taken from them without explanation. No one dared ask questions. The coffin was draped in black velvet and crowned with a white cross of stitched pearls. The horses were shod in quiet iron, their hooves muffled by cloth. Behind them, nobles rode in cloaks of mourning, and behind them, silence. The kind of silence that follows something unnatural, the kind that burrows into the bone. It rained not heavily, but just enough to make everything shimmer. The procession ended at Windsor Castle, where a vault beneath St. George's Chapel had been prepared. No crowds were allowed inside. Only the priest, the courtiers, the coffin. They lowered her into the earth beneath a ceiling of carved angels, as if to disguise the finality with beauty. There were no screams, no defiance, no famous last words, only a tomb, one designed to vanish into the floor. Henry declared that no queen would ever lie closer to his heart than Jane. He swore she would be buried beside him when his time came. And it was true, she would be. But not because of love, because Jane was the only one who died before she could disappoint him. The others had defied, questioned, failed, survived too long. Jane had done what she was meant to do and died before she could become inconvenient. She became untouchable. The court painted her in gold, called her the pure queen, the quiet wife, the perfect mother. Pain was erased, blood scrubbed away. Her final hallucinations rewritten as holy visions. In portraits she looked porcelain, untouched by childbirth. In sermons she was likened to the Virgin Mary, a woman made sacred by suffering. No mention of the fever, no mention of the torn flesh, no mention of the blackened nails. Henry commissioned a poem in her honor, a sonnet of grief. It mentioned her virtue, her obedience, her giving of life. It didn't mention her death, only her ascent. And so, Jane was lifted. From woman to myth, from mortal to model. The living servant girls who had wiped her brow as she died, who had seen her delusions, her cracked lips, the flies gathering near her open mouth, were not invited to speak of it. They were given coin and silence. The silence stretched for centuries. No scandal clung to Jane Seymour, no affair, no treason, no political sin, because she had not lived long enough to commit one. Her grave remained untouched. Her letters, few and mild, were preserved without annotation. Her dresses were quietly refashioned for other women. The cradle was stored in a gallery, then forgotten. Some say it was destroyed. Others whisper it still exists, sealed behind a false wall. No one has dared look for it, because her story was finished. That was the comfort of Jane Seymour, a queen who left before she could cast a shadow. But the truth is this: she haunts anyway, in the faces of obedient wives, in the trembling hands of royal brides, in the faint bitter scent of lilies in candlelit halls. She lives in the silence between what history says and what the blood remembers. She was not executed, but her death was still a sentence, and the procession that was not a farewell. It was a burial of the truth. She is remembered as the good one. That is her curse. History speaks of 6 queens, but only one died in bed, wrapped in linen and candlelight. The others were cast out, cast aside, or cast down before blades. But Jane was preserved, frozen in the moment before the narrative could fracture, before ambition could be whispered, before power could turn poisonous, before she could be real. To remember Jane Seymour is to remember silence, the soft kind that coats the walls after prayer. the strategic kind that suffocates dissent, the enforced kind that binds women tighter than iron. Her legacy was forged not in what she did, but in what she did not live long enough to do. And so they made her holy. She had no scandals, no lovers, no disobedience. She asked no questions, raised no voice. History rewarded her by polishing her bones into myth. She gave England a son, and for that she was canonized not by church but by court. The story they tell is this: she was meek, she was mild, she loved the king, she gave him his heir. And then, like a candle having fulfilled its purpose, she quietly went out. They do not tell of the 13 days of rot, of the hallucinations, of the cradle that rocked without hands, of the child who would rule for 6 years and die sick, shivering coughing blood into silks stitched with lions. They do not tell of the way her voice unraveled in fever, of how her skin peeled from her feet, of the final moment not peaceful, but rasping her lungs, refusing the script. No, they keep the mask, not the woman. The wax, the myth, the mother unmarred. They built her memory out of what she lacked. The absence of disgrace became the substance of her virtue. In every sermon praising her, the subtext is clear. This is how women should die, quietly, usefully, before they become too much. Jane was survived by her son, barely. Edward VI, king at 9, corpse at 15, buried near his mother, a boy prince shaped by trauma before he could pronounce it, raised in cold chambers with warmer portraits, told that he was the reason she died and the reason she mattered. He would speak of her only once. They said he cried. Henry would marry again 3 more times. One marriage lasted longer than Jane's life. Another ended in execution. The last saw him into the grave, but none of them were allowed to overshadow her. He was buried beside Jane, as promised. In death, Henry sought her. In life, he had barely visited her bedside, but the story had to close neatly. The king and the perfect queen, entombed together. But let us imagine not the coffin, not the mask, but the room, the final chamber. No courtiers, no flowers, just a cradle, covered in crimson silk, never used again. And in the corner, the shadow of a woman standing motionless. Not Anne, not Catherine, Jane, not smiling, not mourning, just watching. Her portrait hangs in galleries, pale and serene. Viewers remark on her eyes, on the gentle curve of her mouth. She looks peaceful, they say. But those who look closer notice something else. A tension in the brow, a darkness behind the pupils, as though the painter captured her just before she spoke, or screamed. But she never did. That was the point. Jane Seymour, the obedient one, the fertile one, the queen who died so her son could live. But what if the greater horror is this? She was never truly allowed to live at all. Her story was trimmed, pruned, sanctified. Her letters filtered through men. Her body claimed by myth. Her voice vanished behind curtains of incense and holy oil. Her death is called natural, her end peaceful. But peace in Jane's case was not a comfort. It was a verdict, because silence is not innocence. Obedience is not virtue. And death, when told as a fairy tale, becomes just another method of control. If Jane Seymour had lived, had spoken, had ruled, had failed, she would have become dangerous. So, she is preserved instead, as the example, the exception, the ideal. A woman perfected only in her absence. And what does that tell us? That history prefers a woman unfinished, that power praises sacrifice when the blood is someone else's, that the crown still demands bodies, that legacies are often built on sealed lips and stuffed coffins. She gave them a son. They gave her a silence so total it still echoes, in portraits, in prayers, in the story told to every woman since. Be good, be still, be empty, and maybe you'll be remembered. All power crumbles at the edge of the grave. But obedience never even gets to stand.